Hello and welcome back to Documentary Film, and this week for week 7/module 7, Warrendale and Dying at Grace. Both of these films are difficult to watch, difficult not in a kind of triumph of the will sort of way, but more into the way in which we peer into a world that we don't typically encounter. Warrendale, although the film doesn't tell us what it just presents it to us, is a home for troubled youth. And Dying at Grace is basically the palliative care unit at Grace Hospital in Toronto. So the feature presentation for this week is Warrendale. There will be a viewing quiz on that film that will be opening February 22nd, which is Monday, and running till February 28th. So it'll be open for a week. There is no reading quiz this week, just a viewing quiz on Warrendale. So what I'd like to do is go through the slides and then give you some background information which I found out about the film after viewing it for the first time and having a lot of difficult questions that I needed to have answered. So the first thing we're going to start with is just a quote from Alan King talking about the film. We had a long battle with censorship in Ontario, which was very costly and took a lot of time. The language, which was virtually unprecedented in Canada, really had to do with the amount of swearing that's in the film. The amount of swearing hadn't been used in the film before in Canada, and this caused a lot of grief and a lot of difficulties in terms of who the potential audience was going to be. So what is Warrendale? Well, Warrendale is a school. It's a treatment center for emotionally disturbed children for a variety of reasons, and they are a range of ages from sort of pre-adolescent to late adolescent. They're essentially teenagers. And as you can imagine, a teenager, 12, 13, will be very different than one that's 18, 19. So it is a range of different ages, kids that have different issues, and we find out about them. And Alan King really sat and kind of watched these individuals, filmed over 40 hours of footage to make a 2-hour film. So this is what I mean when last week, and in fact, since the beginning of this course, I've been talking about how, yes, cameras were much lighter, film was much more sensitive to light, there was portable sound equipment, but you still ended up with 40 hours worth of footage. In this case, how do you cut it into a sensible whole? How do you construct the story? Because it is a construct. So keep that in mind, because you're going to find out things about this film that will render the viewing of it somewhat problematic. So King and his very small crew assembled over 40 hours worth of footage to make a 2-hour film. And when this film was originally going to be released on CBC, because of the subject matter and the language, it was decided not to air it. So it just became a film onto itself. Now, the film, in terms of its content and its kind of worldview, we look into Warrendale as a treatment center for children that is very family-like, and where kids can feel safe to express their feelings in whatever kind of foul, salty language they choose, or silence even. There really isn't anything that can sort of prepare you for watching this film. And I say this not in a kind of derogatory, sort of salacious sort of way, but just it's different because at times it is uncomfortable because of the behavior of the kids. Not only that, but the behavior of the adults in the same room, because the film never tells us who these people are. It just simply begins, which in and of itself makes it problematic. One thing that we do see used repeatedly is what's called the holding method. And this was something that was devised by John Brown, and I will talk about John Brown at the end here. Regardless, the film was made, the film was presented and shown in theaters, and it went on to win the Prix d'Art et d'Essai, the Art Prize and Essay Prize at Cannes in 1967. And the film is still used and referred to by sociologists and social workers. It still is an important film, and it still has that impact. Now, what kind of film is it? Clearly, it's a document, but it is also an example of direct cinema. Now, what is direct cinema? Direct cinema is that non-interventionist, observational, objective, fly-in-the-wall kind of point of view. So the filmmaker and the camera people and the sound people are all there, but they are such a small crew, and they are so kind of accustomed to sort of thinking on the fly and really kind of stick handling through situations, that they can work really without a script. They have general ideas of what they wish to film, but the film tries to be as unobtrusive and non-interventionist as possible. So you think about other NFB films that we've watched, where we have kind of the expository voice of God films, where the images are at the service of the voice. We don't have that here, because we don't have a voice that controls the narrative. We don't have a voice that tells us what's going on. We have to experience this almost firsthand, and we have to sort of figure out what's going on. And direct cinema has that capacity. It doesn't tell us what to think, how to respond and behave. We simply just are watching this footage. So direct cinema is non-interventionist and objective. From an equipment point of view, is very interesting, because cameras now are much smaller and lighter and quieter. Cameras now are able to get into the subject matter much more closely. The zoom lens, which was an invention in sort of the mid 60s. By 1967, a lot of people were using the zoom lens. And what does that mean? That means that a camera can be sitting at the opposite end of a room, but the cameraman can zoom in on the action. Now, we take this for granted, but in the early 60s and 50s and early 60s, the zoom lens wasn't around. So the cameraman had to often, or camera person had to often walk towards the subject being filmed. The zoom lens allows the camera person to sit in a corner very quietly and just simply film whatever he or she decides is important. Now, along with very light-sensitive film, natural lighting becomes literally all that's necessary for people to see what's going on. A room doesn't need to be lit in the way that it would have been before, with a lot of extra lighting to get rid of shadows and so on. So zoom lens, natural light, the light-sensitive film stock, and light cameras, all those things come together to allow filmmakers to really work, quote unquote, on the fly. Now, one thing that Alan King does not do is turn away from difficult imagery. There's a fairly substantial amount of conflict that occurs at Warrendale between the inmates, we'll say, the residents, and then between the residents and the staff, issues with the staff themselves. And at times it kind of looks like a home movie, but it's a very difficult to watch at times home movie. So direct cinema and verite, or direct cinema and truth. Direct cinema was more of a North American invention versus cinema verite, which was, because of, as you can imply, the name is more of a sort of a French, like from France, that is, as well as French Canadian invention. But direct cinema really doesn't matter where it comes from, but it certainly is associated with North American filmmaking. And direct cinema here, we end up having subjects who are so used to the camera crew being there that they forget that they're there, right? And of course, the best way to work in a situation like that is to arrive ahead of time and get people comfortable with your presence. So Alan King went to visit, and he got to know the staff members and some of the residents there. So they were comfortable having him there. And by having him comfortable, or having them comfortable, Alan King was able to work and record things that maybe would not have been filmed otherwise had they have been conscious of his presence. They both are and are not. Conscious is in, this is a stranger, versus, oh, I know Alan King, I know who he is. So there's that kind of comfort zone that allows the film to unpack some of the difficult situations that we see. Excuse me. So there is allegedly minimal amounts of editing. Now, why is it alleged? Because there are sequences that are constructed, but we know there's minimal editing. Why? Because the camera does not cut from one to the other. There may be sort of a time lapse of maybe a few seconds, but the events appear to be recorded in exactly the amount of time in which they occurred. And because the camera holds on what's called a long take, right? It's a long shot or long take. The camera may go for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, uninterrupted. No editing, no cutting away especially. So that's a minimal amount of editing, which gives direct cinema its impact, right? The camera's unflinching. It does not look away. Now, cinema verite, the camera itself, the filmmaker, him or herself, and the subjects all interact together. Each of them know their role in the presentation or production of this film. The person that is being filmed is self-aware that they are being filmed, that they are interacting with a potential audience that is later watching the film, as well as the filmmaker that is right there. So it is intrusive to the degree that the subject who is being filmed is aware of the presence of the camera. That's cinema verite, truth cinema, versus direct cinema, where there is no interaction in really any significant way. So reactions to Warrendale, as you can imagine, ran from very good to very hostile. Stanley Coffin, for example, writes, Warrendale is a documentary about emotionally disturbed children. It is not a study. It is not propaganda. It is an experience, passionate and compassionate. So it is an experience. It is because we experience what it's like temporarily to be in this building, in this residence, right, in Warrendale. So it really is impactful, right, emotionally impactful. Now, on the other hand, news statement, the most appalling and effective film I have seen. If Warrendale is a film that we can't bear to be with, then who is at fault? If this is the state of our individuals, then, why are we looking at these people? Why don't we do something? Versus the Financial Times. King presents the children not as deranged case histories, but as people, right, with sensitivity, personality, and an often remarkable degree of charm. They are recognizable, and they show us graphically that the naughty child is often very worried and a frightened child. So there are multiple layers of emotional connection that we have with the residents of Warrendale. But again, we don't know who is who. The film is remarkable in not telling us the relationships between the staff and the residents. We're not quite sure who these people really are, and it's up to us to figure that out. The Evening Standard, the review says it is harrowing and horrifying, but compulsive, right? We can't look away. This is something we've never seen before. Blending into the community house like a fly in the wall. Interesting observation, because that's literally what direct cinema is. King and his cameramen capture startling emotional crises in the lives of the children. So it really captures, in a matter of a couple of sentences, exactly what's going on. We are a fly in the wall, and we are witnessing difficult subject matter. William Zimmerman, though the film is an undeniable emotional experience, it does raise the formal and ethical questions similar to those posed by other direct cinema films, the violation of privacy. We don't know if those kids understood what signing a consent form was like. Did they have rolling consent? Was it just one time, or is it verbal? We don't know. That's something to think about. Consider that. Was the film a violation of privacy? Because it is important. Is it just sensationalism? Are we looking just for conflict? Now, that's a serious issue when I tell you later how the film is structured versus the actual events that occurred. Alan Rosenthal says Warrendale suffers too frequently from an almost grotesque overindulgence. They intrude where they don't belong. They invade privacies in a thoroughly distasteful manner, presumably on the pretext of objectivity and honesty. And they involve the audience not in understanding, but in voyeurism. And again, it's another important point that is raised, because the film does not identify who the people are that we are encountering. We simply see the outside of this building, and we step inside the building, and we're there for almost the entire duration of the film, not till the very, very end. So there is a degree of voyeurism in the sense that we're not acknowledged. That's the thing. As viewers of this film, we're not acknowledged through the camera. And what I mean by that is very rarely do individuals look directly at the camera. In other words, looking directly at us. Now, compare that to Las Hurdas, right? The little kids or the young kids in that school. The camera sort of travels laterally across the desks, and every child looks straight into that camera, right? That defined glare looking right back at the audience. We don't get that here. So yes, there is a degree of voyeurism that we need to address and consider because it does make the film at times difficult to watch. So those are the slides for Warrendale. Now, I just want to read some information to you. So it's a 1967 documentary film by Canadian filmmaker Alan King. It was filmed in the spring of 1966, originally produced for broadcast on CBC television, but never shown due to King's refusal to edit out the copious profanity in the footage. So the film is an excellent example of direct cinema, this kind of window on the world, fly on the wall, whatever you want to call it. Look at the lives of emotionally disturbed children housed in a facility named Warrendale. And Warrendale was in Rexdale, Ontario. So this isn't some far-off place. Rexdale is less than 100 miles away from here, from London. The facility was considered innovative and was met with approval when it first opened up in December of 1965. So the film is built, well, it begins about a year later, and then it's released 2 years after its initial opening in December of 1965. But almost a year after it opened, it became the center of several controversies in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, Queen's Park, let's call it that, and it was eventually closed. So it had faced a complicated power struggle, as well as the resignation of its entire staff. Founder John Brown, who was the gentleman who came up with that holding technique that we'll see in the film, he was a member of the NDP party at Queen's Park from 1967 to 1971. So Brown became involved in an ongoing public debate on the state of mental health in Ontario, particularly over the matter of Ontario children who were found to be receiving psychiatric help in institutions designed for adults. This debate soon became charged, I should say, with politics, as prominent NDP figures, including Stephen Lewis, advocated for changes to the existing system. The system whereby kids were thrown in with adults basically in a psychiatric care system. So, meeting opposition from various members of the reigning Conservative government and some members of the medical establishment. So the PC government at that time were reluctant or resistant to separate kids and young teenagers from adults in psychiatric care facilities. And eventually, it came to a head. The plan was cast aside when Henry resigned on August 24th, claiming that he was unable to reach an agreement with the board of directors over continuing Brown's treatment program, and writing that, quote, the board had lost focus on the treatment of children. The next day, all 40 staff members of Warrendale announced their resignation, citing a lack of positive leadership, and announced a plan to relocate all of the children currently at the Etobicoke Centre to Brown's private camp at Oak Ridges. So the idea of having kids at Warrendale, very soon it became a political debate and a kind of political football that no one wanted to deal with in any responsible manner. And the place finally closed down, and mass resignations immediately before that. So the children at Warrendale, generally between the ages of 9 and 17, arrived with a variety of individual problems. John Brown told the Toronto Star 1965 that, quote, we get the type of child that has been classed as unreachable, end quote. They've gone through hospitals, clinics, they've been caseworked to death. Our methods have to be unorthodox because orthodox treatments have failed with these children, end quote. Patrick Watson, who was a television producer back in the 1960s at CBC, he was also involved in the documentary on the Etobicoke Warrendale facility. He also wrote, quote, the children who lived at Warrendale are people whose lives have gone off the track. Eventually, their paths diverged so far from the normal that it became impossible for them to live a normal family or in a normal family or normal community. Their fears, their rage, their withdrawal had become so extreme that parents and teachers and friends could no longer contact them, and they were lost, end quote. So this emphasis on physical contact, right, what's called the holding technique that we see being used several times. Now, again, it's not identified, it's not explained, it's simply depicted. And we have to watch and figure out what's going on. So the physical contact was part of a larger idea of retrogression. Retrogression technique, in this case, it was trying to take the children back to re-experience their infancy, time when loving, giving substitute parents, in this case the staff, were going to substitute the parents and almost sort of relive their birth and trying to identify the trauma that led to them essentially going off the tracks. So if, in the opinion of the staff, a youngster needed a baby bottle, he was given one, no matter how old they were. The children, even teenagers, are cuddled frequently, tucked into bed. They're bathed, sometimes fed. So they are both adults and treated like children. And this was part of a retrogression back to their childhood to see if they can identify that traumatic moment that led to the issue in the first hand. So during the dispute, the Toronto Star's Marilyn Dunlop wrote an article foreshadowing what would become the general public's primary window into the world of Warrendale, the memories of documentary filmmaker Alan King, who had spent considerable time in Etobicoke Centre in the spring of 1966. So there are some conversations that we see. John Brown speaking to Alan King. He began to visit Warrendale regularly, getting to know the staff and children. So to back up for a moment, we don't see the interviews and the discussions with John Brown, but the conversations with Brown and King led to Alan King deciding to visit Warrendale and make the film. So that's what I want to make clear. So he spent almost a month on the site before bringing in the rest of the crew and any equipment. In a subsequent interview, King stressed his preliminary meetings with the children, saying, quote, "It was essential to obtain their full consent. Before they would agree, they wanted to know why we wanted to make the film and what other people would think of them," quote unquote. According to Marilyn Dunlop's article, King said he told them he wanted to record their daily lives because their feelings were important and their difficulties were problems shared to some degree by all society. So whatever you think of that consent and how it was presented to those individuals, the fact that he wanted to record their daily lives. Now, was he going to stop when things got really rough? Did he mention that to them? And also implying that the difficulties that they had were also shared by the rest of society. Some of the issues that we see are quite difficult, but to say that these are also shared by society, now that's again a very loaded term. Is society responsible for them? Yes. Is it society's fault that these people are suffering? That's more difficult question to answer. So keep that in mind. Okay. After receiving consent to film from the children and staff, King and his crew spent several weeks filming inside one of Warrendale's residences, collecting footage in preparation for a CBC documentary on Warrendale, recording everyday activities ranging from typical games and interactions to holding sessions and bottle feeding. Excuse me. The resulting film, simply entitled Warrendale, presents life inside Warrendale with little additional context. This is almost the purest form of direct cinema you can imagine. And a few other films are like that, but Warrendale really stands above all the others in literally letting us enter into this building at the beginning of just a given day and letting us figure out what's going on. There is no guidance. There is no voice of God. So there's no sense of it being expository. That's what I mean. Okay. So no introduction or narration is provided. The audience is given no initial explanation of what Warrendale is or of the specific problems affecting the children, or even the role of the staff. Scenes of bottle feeding are included, as are scenes of children sitting on the lap of workers. Several holding sessions are shown. These aspects of Brown's methods are interspersed with footage of children and staff playing, eating meals together, watching hockey and TV. The climax of the film comes when the staff breaking the news of the sudden death of Dorothy, the cook, which results in an exhausting episode in which several children experience violent emotional outbursts. So by April of 1967, the CBC had yet to air the completed documentary, and given the nature of the treatment center and the emotionally charged accusations from the previous summer, the CBC's reluctance to air the film seemed understandable. Roy Shields raised several questions in a Star's television column, quote, "With scenes of screaming, hysterical children being held by staff workers, with other scenes of children experiencing regression to bottle feeding, will unprepared viewers understand or be outraged?" End quote. Considering the current political and media controversy over John Brown's methods of treatment, does the film argue for or against him? If so, is it fair? Okay, so ultimately, though, what kept the CBC from airing the film was simply the word fuck. That was what was said, which in the 1960s would have been tantamount to the end of society. That's what it was. So Alan King revealed what had caused the CBC to balk when, in the words of Roy Shields, who had written another article, quote, scenes of children in wild fits of rage cursing their fates while being held in check by Warrendale social workers. That was what was more upsetting. And remember, we're never told what the holding method is, why it's being used, under what conditions, it's going to be used, rather than simply speaking to a child. We don't know any of this. We have to figure out for ourselves. So CBC executives agreed that the film was excellent, but in a statement released to the press, stated that, quote, certain sequences would violate the broadcast regulations, especially the swearing. Following discussions with the producer, it was found impractical to delete from the films the sequences which would be in violation of the regulation. By the time Warrendale was already, by this point they said no, the film had already been sent to New York, London, and Paris, where it was accepted into the Cannes Film Festival and won that particular year. So Shields predicted, quote, that there is the fear that only after it has been accepted abroad, it will be deemed fit for home consumption. Politics aside, that's what really hurts, that on our own, we haven't got the guts to show this film, end quote. So Warrendale did win awards at Cannes. French film director Jean Renoir, very famous and respected film director from working as early as the 30s right till the 60s, declared King a great artist. And in 2002, Warrendale was honored with being a masterwork, quote unquote, by the Audiovisual Preservation Trust of Canada. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire film. I'll do that when we meet on Wednesday, hopefully. I would appreciate if some of you showed up. Okay, so it's about 26 minutes here. I'm just going to finish up with an epilogue, which is, again, some information here. This is basically stuff I found off the net, which is very useful. Okay, Warrendale is a kind of sensationalistic film. It relies on close-up shots of suffering, screaming children to make its impact felt. A lot of people have claimed to be deeply moved by Warrendale, but the fact of the matter is that Warrendale offers very little in the way of a story. Warrendale is really filmed theater of the absurd, masquerading as socially sensitive documentary. As a drama, it fails to deliver a sense of meaning. What's going on? Why is this happening? Who are these people? What am I supposed to feel? All these things matter. And at the end, we have no more insight into the lives of its protagonists than we did at the beginning. Now, this is not me venting. This is information that I collected. I'm just going to take a look here. 6, 7. Okay, so these are just basically comments on the web. I had this information quoted somewhere here. Okay, anyway, so I'm going to carry on. For some people, this is because Warrendale captures the human condition. Alan King did not conceal the fact that the final scene in Warrendale, now this is important, Alan King did not conceal the fact that the final scene in Warrendale actually occurred soon after he began shooting. In fact, he even bragged about it. It was, he said, a lucky break. Remember this, a lucky break because it resulted in heightened emotions, more drama, which meant more screaming. Canadian theaters tended to equate showing with drama, and in Warrendale, as in much Canadian theater, there's no real violence in the sense of characters following through in their extreme emotions, but there is an awful lot of screaming. So, in a hidden way, it's also a somewhat violent film. Right? My hunch is the violence in Warrendale occurs off camera. Someone dies. In the film, she dies near the end. Pay attention. Dorothy, the cook. In the film, she dies near the end. But in real life, Dorothy had died much earlier. So one might therefore say we're watching the film backwards, or that the climax actually occurs at the beginning and everything that occurs afterwards is a kind of denouement. It's an unfolding. So the position that this author takes, Dorothy's death was the triggering incident that lies behind all of the extreme acting out that makes up the storyline of this at times confusing film. Now, did you understand that? The film shows, well, it doesn't show the death, but it reports the death of Dorothy the cook. And this comes at the very tail end of the film, and there's not much more to go, maybe another 15, 20 minutes of also difficult, viewing. But what has happened is King, because he's got 40 hours of material to choose from, chooses to give us these very real and violent outbursts of grief and almost bordering on mania that the children are experiencing of the loss of Dorothy that they loved and respected. But the film does not show this until the very end. In fact, doesn't tell us in the film, oh, by the way, what you're watching at the beginning is grief and suffering, right? And the gnashing of teeth and the rest of it over an event that I'm not going to tell you about till 2/3 of the way through the film. Keep that in mind. So, the writer goes on, this causes me to wonder, since the children's behavior is so extreme throughout, if what we're actually seeing is the aftermath of Dorothy's death played out by the children in scene after scene. So these are things that are worth thinking about because it does really impact how we view the film. If that's actually the case, then we have been misled by the director who wants us to think these children always acted the way they do in Warrendale. His cinema verite techniques, now, he kind of confused it. He or she, I'm going to find out who wrote this because it is really important, and I'm quite shocked that I did not put that information at the end of it, but I did get it off the net. Okay, so the techniques are called cinema verite. Truth cinema, yes, but this is direct cinema. This is objective, unobtrusive, fly-on-the-wall cinema. So there's no narration of any kind. Leaves us with the impression of just how it is at Warrendale, when in fact that was not the case. Warrendale could have been pretty quiet all the way through, but Alan King chooses not to tell us why the residents of Warrendale are suffering and screaming and carrying on, these violent outbursts, and then tacks on 2/3 of the way through the reason, which is the death of Dorothy. So is that ethical? Does it make it problematic? I'll ask you to consider that as you watch it. So by moving the defining event of the film to the end without any explanation, he lets us walk away from the film with an uneasy impression that this is a film about disturbed children reflecting the human condition. Somehow that we are all disturbed. So the really disturbing thing about the film is that the audiences, encouraged by critics, seem to explain or accept this explanation. And really, we walk away deceived. Right? We're not being told what's going on. We can be objective and unobtrusive and non-interventionist, but we need to know why things are occurring. So into this strange environment comes a film crew. Director Alan King, plus camera and sound person. They live with the children for about a month before they start filming. But soon after they start filming, the children's favorite adult, Dorothy, the cook, suddenly dies. So I try to imagine how I would react. 1, if I were a child, and 2, if I were Alan King. As a child, of course I'd be in shock. But then I would start to ask, as one boy does in the film, how does a young, healthy lady suddenly die for no reason? The question never gets answered. Instead, the filmmakers focus on children being held in an exhausting scene that Larry and I agree that should have been cooked up by the staff to satisfy the filmmakers' need for catharsis. So Larry and I am going to find out who I is. But the second one, if I were Alan King and I were shooting a documentary in a children's home and the cook died during the first week, I might go ahead and film the children's emotional reactions to the announcement and also the funeral a few days later that we do see. However, I think I would feel obligated to look into the cause of the death. I'd make sure to record the children's conversations as they talked about it. I'd get the staff to weigh in, plus the result of the autopsy. I can't imagine this strange early plot twist not becoming part of the film over the next 7 weeks at Warrendale. So these are problematic issues. Of course, I'm not Alan King, and that's not what Alan King did. Instead, what he recorded were all those scenes of what appears to be sometimes pointless emotional meltdowns, when in fact they were caused by grief. But we don't know that. We don't see that in the film. Carol refusing to get out of bed, Tony climbing on top of the armoire to avoid going to bed, children running away, Carol sitting on Dr. Fisher's lap as he coaches her in writing a nasty letter to her parents, in which she expresses the wish never to see them again. Other children fighting with staff, children spitting, crying, being held, bottle fed. Irene attending her anniversary party, so drugged up she can hardly walk and needs help to sit down. So these instead are the scenes that Alan King filmed in the weeks after Dorothy died. So Dorothy's death never comes up until the end of the film. So the writer of this short blurb here says, look, neither am I one of the kids, but if I were, during those 7 weeks, I would have been wondering from time to time, like, not who killed Dorothy, but how did she die? That's a valid question. So they were never told anything, but that we overhear two staff members saying Dorothy may have died after receiving an abortion. He passes this on to the other kids, although it may only have been a rumor. And certainly the filmmaker omitted it because at that point, abortion was illegal in Ontario. So the context in which it is occurring, if this is what happened, it is possible that Dorothy may have died from a botched abortion, which was illegal at that time in Ontario in 1966. So the whole event would have been shameful, dangerous, kind of backroom or back alley kind of stuff. Very, very dangerous at that time. So if there was secrecy about this traumatic event, then these kids could wonder if it was connected to the presence of strangers on their property. Why these people suddenly show up, very shortly after Dorothy has died. Who are they? So how could they not have thought this? Which would have tended to undermine trust, which is something Alan King emphasized was an essential part of the filmmaking process. So do the kids in the film appear to trust the adults they are living with day and night? I can't recall a single scene suggesting that they do. And if I were a kid living at Warrendale, and the one adult I could relate to and talk to and like and love mysteriously dies, yeah, I'd be concerned. So I would be traumatized by the loss of that trusted person, and further traumatized by the presence of the film crew. So as much as Alan King got the consent, and this could have been well before Dorothy died, it was not what's called rolling consent. Rolling consent is something that we have now with individuals that choose to participate, for example, in a series of interviews, or to be, to interact with an institution. Rolling consent means that you can back out at any moment. I doubt this was happening at the time. So imagine those kids giving consent, to Alan King, and he just hangs around, and Dorothy dies. And within a few days, the film crew arrives. And no one's answering any questions. How did she die? What happened to her? No one's saying anything. So it is problematic, to say the least. So the article ends, perhaps I'm overreacting, but I can't get over the announcement scene where Walter tells the kids they must not think their thoughts and feelings somehow caused Dorothy's death. A strange thing to be telling them, while Carol screams hysterically and the rest of them look stunned. The same boy who asked how she died asks Walter what he means by that. Well, Walter explains, children often imagine that they are to blame when someone dies. The boy still doesn't see why he should be devastated. She was no relative of mine, he says. When Walter repeats that the kids could not have killed Dorothy with their minds, the boy says, I am aware of that, end quote. His expression seems to be saying, Walter, you're kind of nuts to be suggesting that we killed her. So come to think of it, if the film's only mention of a possible cause, that the children killed her with their minds, is kind of preposterous. However, King said himself that Dorothy's death was the unforeseen event that gave Warrendale its dramatic edge. It triggered the children's fearful, angry outburst, which impressed critics and audiences around the world. Even Jean Renoir said he had never seen a documentary as powerful as Warrendale. So the question becomes, who benefited from all of this? So to be on the safe side, we'll say the camera. That's it. So I will find out who wrote that because it is here. And I printed it out, and usually I cite my sources, at least I should, but I will find that out for you. So I apologize ahead of time. So as you're watching Warrendale, and please do watch Dying of Grace. I'm going to double check the links, make sure that they're active. I know the one for Warrendale presently is, but I'm going to make sure that, or presently is not, but I'm going to make sure it is. So when you're watching the film, think about the difference between cinema verite, which is interventionist, and direct cinema, which is what Warrendale is. The kinds of practical technological changes that took place in the 1950s and early 60s that would allow filmmakers to get much closer to the subject matter. Watch for the use of that zoom lens and constant reframing, because the film does not cut from one camera to the other, but it does reframe constantly, and it catches things in the foreground, the midground, the background. And think about how direct cinema interacts with its subjects. And if, as you watch both Dying at Grace and Warrendale, really that's the most important thing. What does cinema direct insist about its subjects? Which is that it's non-interventionist. It's objective. Now think about all the things I've just told you about the events that occur in real life, right, that surround the story and what Alan King actually filmed. So Warrendale is powerful, at times difficult to watch, but it's worth viewing all the way through. It is a powerful film. So that's it for me now. I'm going to come back on Wednesday. Please do drop by. I've had no one for the last 3 weeks, so I don't know if all of you are understanding what's going on and you're good, but you have to let me know. Okay, so take care, and I will see you hopefully on Wednesday. And that is the end.